So now let me start with the micro level and then work our way out to the larger societal issues, in fact. Now, the mitochondria, we start really at the cellular level. These are dynamic organelles referred to as the energy factories in each cell. And when you have mitochondrial dysfunction, that is strongly associated with a neurodegenerative process in the brain and elsewhere. Now, I know that I hadn't used this term since high school biology, but the Kreb cycle. The Kreb cycle is that process whereby the cell takes in glycogen, thyroid hormone, other elements, and kind of through a variety of activities will kind of result in adenosine triphosphate. ATP is really kind of seen as a unit, the value of energy that's being produced by the mitochondria. Here is the take-home message today. Energy, expending energy, increases the number of energy-producing mitochondria per cell. Literally, a body in motion tends to stay in motion. A body at rest tends to stay at rest. At the cellular level, that is true. We know, actually, when you take people who are otherwise healthy but sedentary, compare them on all these factors, make them very equal to somebody. The only thing they differ on is they're actually exercising 3 to 4 times a week. The people who are having sedentary lifestyles have fewer mitochondria per cell, and their mitochondria are not functioning as well as those people of equal age and health status who are actually active. So exercise clearly increases mitochondrial function. Well, that's a pretty nasty recursive loop, isn't it? Because when I'm fatigued, what am I likely to do? You know, I'm going to sit here on the couch for another couple hours, just zone out in front of TV. When in fact, if I do that, then I further lower mitochondrial activity, producing less energy, and I'm even less likely to get up off the couch or feel any sense of energy. So it's exactly when we least feel emotionally like being active that we've got to kind of get it in our brains that that's exactly the time you want to get up and about. Now there is ample evidence showing that in fact mitochondrial dysfunction is responsible for reactive oxidative stress, that process that we predominantly associate with aging. Now, this is not really the fountain of youth that we've discovered, but do understand, you know, in terms of teasing out aging process versus mitochondrial function, when you compare people in their 70s who are fairly active, you know, whether it just be walking for 30 minutes 4 or 5 times a week, and you compare them to 30-year-olds, sorry, the 70-year-old does not have mitochondrial function that's even near a person in their 20s and 30s. But they do have substantially more mitochondria per cell and higher mitochondria producing function than people who are 20 years younger than them, but are sedentary. So the 50-year-old who is sedentary is producing less energy than the 70-year-old who's being active. And finally, think of this. The last 6 or 7 years has seen just a mushrooming of research on telomeres. Telomeres are described as the caps at the end of the chromosome chain that protects it, if you will, from damage. Now, those telomeres will actually kind of shorten each time, endangering their protective ability for the chromosome chain with each cell division. Turns out, though, that telomerase, that enzyme that helps maintain the health of these caps, these telomeres, telomerase is higher for people who are active. So that might be why what you're seeing is a slowing of the aging process for people who are able to maintain activity because their mitochondria activity is higher. Now, a major factor involved in fatigue and energy level are the hormones in circulation and intracellularly. Now, I'm not an endocrinologist, but a couple of important things I think, regardless of what how you practice healthcare to understand. One is that as long as we don't have chronic fatigue, most of us in this room right now have about 4, 5, even 6 times more cortisol in our blood than we did at 4 a.m. Okay? Most of us will experience a surge of cortisol that will trigger thyroid-stimulating hormone and a variety of other things that start the escalation of energy. We get up at about 8, 9, 10 o'clock. We are kind of at a pretty good peak of cortisol-induced energy. The problem is that while stress can induce these cortisol changes, chronic cortisol actually has been shown not only to lead to immunosuppression, but also lower thyroid function, which actually will now impair the energy that we would expect. So when you look at the hormones, certainly estrogen and progesterone are strongly associated with fatigue. But when I look at the peer-reviewed research literature, what's interesting is that more of the kind of randomized controlled trial studies in the last few years have focused on testosterone. Now, as one example of how important just testosterone is for energy levels, not sure why, but they kind of focus a fair amount on men who are HIV positive, suffering from substantial fatigue. When they do trials and they compare, is this fatigue kind of in part serotonin mediated and reflective of depression because of their health status, give them either an antidepressant or elevate their testosterone levels. Elevating testosterone levels does a whole lot more for increasing their energy than giving them an antidepressant. So thyroid hormone is implicated in a lot of things: thermal regulation, not only fatigue and energy, but also mood, cognitive functioning, clarity of thought, ability to kind of have short-term memory operate well, and so forth. The thing you should know, however, is that in terms of prevalence, it's been estimated that 30% of women over the age of 55 have some type of hypothyroidism. Now, that number is expected to climb dramatically in the next 2 to 3 years because they're changing the guidelines. A number of committees and organizations are looking at the fact that, for TSH, for normal levels, I think 0.5 to 5.0, and it's a lot of women, but the patients are saying, wait a minute, I know I'm, quote, in the normal range, but I still suspect my thyroid isn't doing its job. And so when they're starting to now relook at the evidence, they're seeing, you know what, we've probably underestimated the impact of the thyroid if you have TSH levels that are even above 3 or 3.5. So that estimated prevalence is likely to climb in the next few years because of changing guidelines. But one thing I want you to focus on, actually, and maybe even go to this website and get a copy of this white paper from the National Academy of Hypothyroidism. You can find it at www.nahypothyroidism.org. Now here, a white paper, quickly if you're not familiar with the concept of a white paper, it's people who are pretty intelligent who review the literature, but they're trying to make a specific point. Now this group basically has about 180 references from peer-reviewed literature, and their argument is this, that in fact, when you do a blood draw measuring thyroid function, and whether it be TSH or T3, T4 levels, that's actually probably a pretty poor indication of how much T3 is actually getting and used by the cell. That instead, they're critical of the medical community because they've assumed a diffusion hypothesis. If you just have enough of these hormones in blood, it'll kind of make its way into the cell. But they're arguing, no, not really, because if you just measure TSH, that's actually a pretty poor indicator of looking at the impact of thyroid, because that's just looking at pituitary thyroid levels and not levels even in different locations of the body. Their argument basically is that many people, more than we thought before, suffer from an abnormal thyroid transport. There's poor conversion from T4 to T3, and that T3 may not actually be making its way into the cell to be used as a source of energy. So that in fact, T4 levels might be elevated when there is this problem. Why? If it's not getting into the cell, then it's kind of starting to accumulate out in blood and serum. So their argument is actually perhaps more often we should be looking at what many clinical labs can perform, which is a reverse T3 count. That may be a better indicator, they argue, of perhaps a poor thyroid transport or a poor conversion problem, converting T4 to T3. And they have dozens of studies demonstrating that this low thyroid transport, very little hormone getting intracellularly, is found in patients with diabetes, other metabolic problems, obesity, people with mood disorders, depression, anxiety, as well as those with chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia. And obviously, if you aren't getting T3 into the cell, then the mitochondria are not going to have enough elements and substances to create the energy they're designed to create. In this paper, they also point to 2 anti-anxiety medications. There's no other evidence, studies haven't been done, on other anti-anxiety agents. But what happens when you go to the doctor and you're complaining of poor sleep, fatigue, and so forth? Primary care doc may actually prescribe an anxiolytic. Well, it turns out that Xanax and Ativan actually lower the level of T3 that you can find in your cell. So we've now, quote, addressed the anxiety that might make it hard for you to fall asleep, but we, at the same time, may be contributing to the fatigue you feel throughout the day because of influencing T3 intracellularly. Now, stress is one thing that can lower levels of both T3 and T4 in cells. The 50%, you got to be a little cautious because stress research is often plagued with a lot of subjectivity, measurements problems, and so forth. So that 50% is probably a little high. But people who are yo-yo dieters, people who go, oh, you know what, I just tried that pineapple diet. I ate nothing but pineapple for 3 days or something like that. When you substantially alter the nutritional composition of the food you take in, you also are lowering cellular T4 levels. Now, if there's a disappointment from this white paper, it's that in 2012, there's not really a good amount of data, randomized controlled trials and so forth, looking at, okay, so how do you increase intracellular levels of T3? How do you specifically improve this thyroid transport problem? Well, they're saying don't have the data, but we know that for good thyroid function, we should be promoting certainly the vitamins A, B, B6, B12 specifically, as well as vitamin C, making sure that that's adequate or maybe even higher than what we have assumed to be healthy in the past. Looking at, there's ample evidence that flaxseed might improve this condition. Kind of the T4, if synthroid and other kind of compounds aren't effective, you might look at the fact that maybe part of the reason is it's not getting converted to T3. So zinc and selenium might be some of those elements that would be important. Iodine, tyrosine, things that you might find in seeds, dark greens, and so forth. So this is kind of in the stage where there's a good evidence that there's probably a problem, and we've identified that it's been underappreciated until recently. In terms of interventions, not clear direction, but certainly we have a half dozen or more different things to promote thyroid health.